Hey crafty friends, welcome back to the Whimsy Stamps channel. Today I'm sharing a card with you featuring the newly released Twinkle Scribble circle die. Now there is a product reveal video for this die with more details, and I will link that video up in the card above. I'm going to start working on my background first. And I've chosen several of my favorite colors, which is different shades of purple and teal. I have wilted violet, shaded lilac, peacock feathers, salty ocean, and mermaid lagoon distress oxide inks. And I also have a piece of Bristol smooth cardstock that I'm beginning my ink blending on. Now, I realize this looks like a hot mess at the moment, but I will continue adding and blending the colors together until they start to look as if they're kind of melting together. It does take a little bit of work because these shades are not exactly right next to each other on the color wheel, but eventually I do get a look that I really like. I've also decided to cover up that shaded lilac with wilted violet, so you'll notice here that the lighter shade of purple is completely gone. At this point, the panel is looking much better, and those transition lines are hardly noticeable. And so I thought I would take my blender brush to try to buff out any that are still left. So I'm going to be creating a bokeh effect on this background, and if you're not familiar with what this technique is, it's basically a photography technique that is like a soft out of focus blur in photographs. So typically you would see these circular out of focus points of light, and I'm going to be creating the bokeh effect using white pigment ink. I've taken a piece of acetate and I've die cut several different sizes of circles using some circular dies to create sort of a stencil. Then I'm ink blending several of the circles using 3 of the shades from the background, but this time I'm just using regular distress inks. I feel like the distress inks are more bold, and so I wanted a little bit more of a layered dimension in the background with several of the darker circles before adding the pigment ink. Now, when creating a bokeh effect background, you do want to overlap some of the circles. You also want to have different intensity of color in your inks, as well as different sizes. And I think the combination of those 3 gives you the most stunning results. So once I've added my distress inks, I'll switch to adding my white pigment ink. So here I have that same little stencil that I've created. I've just kind of cleaned it off. And I'm going to begin layering the circular shape using the white pigment ink. Now, this is where the card really comes together for me and has that bokeh effect. I do cover quite a bit of the background with the white pigment ink, and at first I am using the ink sparingly. But as I continue building the layers, I do intensify the amount of ink that I'm adding. By adding this bokeh effect onto this background, I really cover up any of those harsh transition lines between some of the ink blending. And because this is pigment ink, once I finish adding all of it onto my background, I will set this panel aside to completely dry before I come back and work on it again. I took a piece of silver mirror cardstock that I had, and I die cut the newly released Twinkle Scribble circle die. I did use a metal shim in my die cutting, so if you're struggling to die cut intricate dies like this or fine detailed dies, try using a metal shim in your die cut sandwich. For the sentiment on this card, I'm using the Everyday Scripted Sentiment Clear Stamp Set, and I have picked out Christmas Wish for this card. It takes a little trial and error here to line everything up, but I feel like there was no room for error because basically this card is the sentiment and that die cut. And I wanted it to be as centered as possible. So I really tried my hardest, and here I'm just messing with the placement, trying to make sure it's center. But I'll show you here in just a moment how I fix this off-center sentiment that I stamp. So I am treating my panel with anti-static powder, and I've sort of debated on what color sentiment I wanted to stamp. I do stamp it with clear embossing or clear embossing ink and then add black embossing powder. And I think if I was to go back and create this card again, I wouldn't use black embossing powder for my sentiment, or I wouldn't use the silver cardstock for my die. But hindsight, you know. Anyway, I'm just adding the black embossing powder, and then I'll use my heat gun to melt that. Now at this point, when I have the die cut centered onto my panel, I'm noticing that it's off. And no, I'm not measuring it with the ruler. I'm just kind of trying to visualize how much needs to be taken off one side, or actually it's two sides because the top is not centered either. So I just kind of eyeball it. Maybe that was the problem the first time, I don't know, but I'm just gonna kind of eyeball it, and then I just use my trimmer to trim down the panel. And originally it was gonna be a A2 size panel, but because I had to trim this down, I just popped the panel onto a piece of black cardstock and sort of peeking out to tie in the sentiment as well. I was also able to keep some of those inner pieces of my die cut in, and that's where I placed these thin strips of foam adhesive to pop up that die cut. And then once I have that foam adhesive adhered, I go ahead and I add that circular die cut to the center of my panel. I took a piece of fun foam and I've adhered it to the back of the main panel, and then all of that I'm going to adhere the entire thing to a black mat and adhere that to a side folding A2 size card base. To finish this card off, I'm taking several of these flat back beads in silver and then just adding them randomly across the card panel. I'll use some liquid adhesive to adhere those down, and that will kind of finish my card off for today. So it is a little bit different than what I usually create, but I do love this card even though I'm not crazy for that sentiment color choice. I'm sure it will grow on me. Anyway, I want to thank you so much for stopping by today and spending a little time with me. I hope you are enjoying the content that we bring you. We love hearing your feedback and suggestions for future videos. So I encourage you to leave a comment letting us know what you would like to see from the Whimsy Stamps design team. Thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you another time.